Welcome to the summit, Being No More, No Less, the Mind at Rest. And I now have the pleasure to introduce you to Richard Sylvester. Hi, Richard.
Hello there. Hi.
And you are an author, you are a lecturer and a speaker of non-duality, and you're also a humanistic psychologist. And I'm here to interview you today about liberation or non-duality. What is that? And I've read your book, I Hope You Will Die Soon, Words on Non-Duality. And that's a very strong title and a little bit scary too. But do you have the book right there? You can show me. I only have the Kindle version. So.
I have indeed. Yeah, this is a slightly tattered copy of my first ever book on non-duality. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful book. And it was like, it was speaking to me. I was like, wow. And you also have some other books like the non-duality questions, non-duality answers.
Yeah. And this is the latest book. Yeah. Yeah. Many questions and answers in there. Yes,
yeah.
Indeed.
And your new book, you have a very new one, The Confessions of a Seeker, right?
I do indeed. And it's very unlike the others because there you go, Confessions of a Seeker. So there are 4 books on non-duality, which is quite a lot. And then this last book, the latest book, is about the many years that I spent seeking, both, I would say, through spiritual pathways and through therapy and all sorts of things like that. And it's got a few philosophical chapters in it as well. So it's very unlike the other books.
Okay. Yeah, well, yeah, they are, all the titles are very interesting. And so the one I've read, I Hope You'll Die Soon, yeah, it's all about liberation. And it is about the dying of the person we think we are, which doesn't actually exist. So it's no one. There's actually no one here, no one there. There's no Richard, there's no Susan. It's just happening. And that's liberation when the person falls away, you could say. So yeah, can you speak about what liberation is? Because a lot of people think it's one thing, liberation, enlightenment, awakening, Christ consciousness, Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it, God. It's like, what is it we are talking about? And are we talking about the same thing too, right? It's confusing in many ways.
Whether we're talking about the same thing is an interesting question because many people use this word in lots of different ways, and in a way it's a confusing word, but we have to use language. So what I would say, to try to keep it fairly simple, is that well, sometimes I talk about liberation, awakening, liberation. Sometimes I talk about the seeing of non-duality. And what I would say is that consists of the seeing through the reality of the self, of the person, or I should really say the apparent self or the apparent person. So for almost all of us, for almost all of the time, it seems like there's a separate person who exists in an external world. And, we could very simply say, well, that's duality. Duality means two or two-ness. What is that two-ness? Well, it consists of one thing in that two-ness is my sense of myself as separate. And the other thing in that two-ness is everything else, the external world that I move through. And we could say that's the everyday reality for most of us. So when we talk about non-duality, we're talking about the possibility of the sense that this is separate from the world that it moves through, that sense simply collapsing. It just kind of, I could say, disappearing. It's very difficult to put this into words, of course. When that sense collapses, we could say that's when non-duality is seen. And non-duality, as opposed to duality, means, let's say, not to, one or not to. In other words, the revelation, if you like, is that this is not separate from everything else that apparently exists. And something else I would add to that is that in that seeing, this does sound very, very mysterious, but unfortunately we have to use inadequate words, that in that seeing, it's seen that this and everything else that appears is both completely empty and also completely full. Sometimes this is described as nothing, which is a reference to the emptiness, and everything, which is a reference, if you like, to the fullness. And the only thing that I would add at this point, and then I think I'll hand it back to you for another question, is to say, well, a natural question might be, if this is both empty and full, if it's nothing and everything, what is the nature of the everything? What is the nature of the fullness? And although no language, obviously in a way, no language can really touch this or describe it, for me, the best phrase to use would be unconditional love.
Yeah.
So the suggestion from here is that when the self collapses, it can, if you like, finally, if there's been a lot of searching, be seen that this is empty and it's full, and the nature of that fullness is unconditional love. And what tends to happen then is that the seeking person, you know, the one who felt there was something missing and needed to find it, that tends to simply collapse. So if you like, no more seeking. It's the end of seeking.
Yeah. Yeah, because you realize there's nothing to find. It's already here. You are already it, right?
It's already here, but it's hidden by the apparent self.
Yeah.
When the apparent self collapses, then it can be noticed that it's already here.
Yeah. And it, like, dying, it's a very strong word, because something in us is like, no, I don't want to die. But it's nothing is actually dying as such. Nothing of value, you could say, in a way, right? Because the mind is always seeking for something, either in the world of things, or in spirituality, or in many lives, or whatever it's seeking, or making sense of the world and meaning and purpose. And it's always actively kind of seeking something, and that falls away. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yeah, we could say that what apparently dies, it's only an apparent death, because the self that dies never really existed anyway. So we could say, perhaps, you know, that the self, the apparent self, is always seeking, 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 and that is then what apparently dies. And so, in a sense, we're talking about a loss here. We're talking about a loss of the sense of personhood, a loss of the seeking self. But in a way, that loss is an incredible relief, or it may be experienced as an incredible relief, to suddenly realize that there was no one seeking, and there was nothing to seek, and there was nothing that could ever be found. And sometimes that can be experienced as a tremendous relief, and a kind of enormous kind of relaxation can then come over the one who used to be a seeker. I mean, it's impossible to describe this, but when asked to, the nearest I can get to it is say, well, it's at the very least, it's a profound relaxation.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like there's a contraction and a tension in the seeking self, which isn't really even noticed until it disappears.
Yeah. Yeah, so you don't even really realize how contracted you are till it's gone. Then you're, oh, wow, it's yeah, freedom, right? Like you feel free, or and that actually also makes me the word free will. We always think we have to make a choice, and there's free will, and it can be kind of a burden, because oh no, what am I going to choose, and did I choose the right thing, and oh I did, oh, and all this future and past, and oh, it becomes so complex. But apparently there's not even free will. No one is making choices, right?
Yeah, there's a paradox here, because for the one who's seeking, the suggestion that it's not quite right to say they have no free will. It's more correct to say, well, there is no one. So the question of free will can't arise. But if we stick with kind of the common way of putting it, for the one who's seeking, it can be a tremendous challenge. And even it can be a tremendous insult to suggest that they, you have no free will. But when the sense of person drops and it's seen that there's no question of free will because there's no person who could own free will, that may be experienced as a tremendous relief. And you've made reference, for example, to the effect that it might have on feelings and thoughts about the past and the future, and we can go into that more if you want to. But there can be a radical reorientation to, let's call it, the life memories of the character, when it's realized that there never was a person who made any choices. So it's not that there is somebody here who doesn't have free will, it's that the question of free will doesn't even arise when it's seen that there is no one here.
Yeah. Yeah, and because you also in your book you talk about, for example, therapy and also meditation and all those different things that we do in life to go somewhere. But it doesn't matter what it is you do, because you're not going anywhere, because you don't exist in the first place, right?
Yeah. None of these things, in a way, none of these things were things that we actually chose to do. And so it's seen as, in a way, everything is kind of gloriously meaningless. Everything is gloriously meaningless. Now, I've trained in humanistic psychology and various approaches to therapy. I can be very enthusiastic about therapy in terms of, the person seeking to ameliorate their suffering, to decrease their suffering. I think therapy can be a wonderful way of doing that. I have been a long-term meditator, and I meditated for many years, and still meditate, because I find it very enjoyable. And it can also ameliorate suffering. It can be, if you like, good for us as a person. So there's no, there's nothing here that sort of is saying, oh, therapy or meditation, oh, forget it. Nothing like that at all. But it's just, the recognition, and there can be a huge relief in this recognition that actually, I never had to do anything to find out who I really was. I mean, in a sense, the whole sort of spiritual path, and in some ways the stress of the spiritual path, can come from that kind of feel, I need to find out who I really am. But when the self collapses, that question just disappears in a puff of smoke.
Okay. Yeah. And so how does that happen? How do I disappear in a puff of smoke?
I wish I could tell you. If only I could tell you that. Uh, I mean, all I can say is that it can happen, and that there are many, many reports. And we can spin lots and lots of stories about how it happens, and in the end, we're just left with a mystery. What we can say is that, that for most of us, not necessarily for absolutely everybody, but for most of us, there is a pretty solid sense of separation. There is this separate person here who has, certain treasures, if you like, and those treasures are things like a past, a present, and a future, a life through which they move, perhaps goals, perhaps aims, perhaps motivations, values, all sorts of things that they consider important, and of course, perhaps most sacred of all, free will through which they can make choices. And all we can really say is that I sometimes call that a character. What seems to be the person is really, it's just a character. It's kind of like a pretense. It's almost like a character in a play. And that sense can simply collapse.
Yeah. So you can't really...
In a way, that's how it can happen. How it can happen is that it happens. And I know that's a very unsatisfactory thing to say for the mind. It doesn't really answer the mind's question. But ultimately, one of the things about this is, of course, the mind wants all its questions answered. And with this, it gets none of its questions answered. What happens with this is there comes a point at which the mind is seen to be irrelevant.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like we take the mind to be us or something, but in a way it's just another sense, right? Like we have all these different senses of hearing and seeing and touching and smelling and tasting, and then there's the mind that kind of makes meaning of the world, mostly probably for survival, but we take it to, we really believe everything our minds tells us, right? Like all the thoughts, and then there are all the emotions and feelings that is, this body system has, and it's just, we completely get lost in that, and we take it all to be ourselves, although it's just something that happens, and there's nothing personal about it.
It's a good way of putting it, yes. We have, again, I have to say, of course, there isn't really such a thing as the mind. There's simply a process of experiencing, a process of thinking, of feeling, of perceiving, and that kind of all adds up to our sense that there is a mind. And then, as you've already suggested, we take that mind to be what we are. So I think of myself as, if you like, the minding process. When this is seen through, it's a real shock, actually, for the mind to be, if you like, unthroned or dethroned.
Yeah.
And to realize that, if you like, fundamentally, we could say that all there is a phenomena happening. Sometimes some speakers say all there is whatever's happening. In other words, there are experiences. At the moment, I'm aware my hand is moving about, for example. So there are experiences. There's the movement of a hand, there's the sound of a voice, there's, seeing something on the computer screen and so forth. There's also, this process of thinking and believing and conjecturing and looking for meaning and creating and finding meaning. It's just that particular bit of experience we take as that is what I really am. Most of us don't take the moving of the hand or the smelling of supper as, oh, that's what I really am. What I really am is the sensation of smelling my supper. Probably nobody does do that, but we do tend to go, what I really am is this process of thinking and apprehending and cogitating. So again, it can be a bit of a shock to realize that this is, if you like, something which is simply arising out of nothing. What is the mind? The mind is just the next thought arising and falling away again. And then the next thought arising and falling away again. And the next sensation arising and falling away again. But for the one who feels himself to be, a separate individual with a mind and with free will and with choices to make and so forth, the arising and falling away of thoughts and sensations tends to happen so fast and with such energy that it's very convincing that that is basically all there is, and that's what I really am. Again, it can be a tremendous shock if everything, even just for a split second, if everything just stops and this disappears, and then there is simply what's happening, but with nobody witnessing it or observing it or experiencing it anyway, in any way. Even just as kind of like a split second of that can be a real shock.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know that happened to you, right? You just disappeared, and but everything was still appearing. The world was still appearing, but you were gone. Yeah.
So the kind of the real puzzle, the real kind of core question here, well, how can that possibly happen? You know, so it's like we can imagine or conjecture, or even from our own experience in some ways remember a kind of absence where everything, so I mean, for example, dreamless sleep is like that. So in dreamless sleep, I'm not there, there's nothing happening. You know, it's not quite simply a blank, but let's not talk about that because that's too complicated. The shock of realizing that this can disappear and absolutely everything can simply go on,
Yeah.
just as it is going on. That's nuclear. That's very profound. That is nuclear. The realization, if you like, that this is not a necessary part of everything that's happening. So one of the things I write about and talk about a little bit, I try to get across, because as I've already said, I have a very long history of meditation, and I know many people do. I think meditation's wonderful, but one thing I think that can be a shock, particularly if somebody has been following spiritual paths and meditating and doing things like that, is that there's nothing transcendent about what I'm talking about. You see, in meditation, we can go into transcendental spaces, beautiful, wonderful, translucent, transcendental spaces. But even in the most transcendental, translucent space, somehow I, in a way, am still there. There's still, it might only be a trace of me, might only be a tiny little trace of me, but nevertheless, I am still there. So the shock that this can be completely absent, not in a meditative state, just completely absent, and yet everything is going on not transcendently, not translucently, simply as it always does, if you like, simply in an everyday sense. That is the tremendous shock.
Yeah. Yeah, that is that simple and ordinary, and we are all liberated already. It's like, what? Yeah. And that is like, yeah, the mind cannot grasp that, and nor does it need to, right? It's just the mind just does what it does, and that's it. And that's why things don't really change after after you awake to your true nature of just this being. It's an awareness, right? It's a being. It's just what is. But it's just, we cannot understand that, and it has to, you have to be it before you know it, right?
In a manner of speaking, I mean, I would say, well, you know, we can never be it, because what we're talking about is precisely the seeing that we're not there. So yeah, we can never be this, but this can be seen when we are not, or when we are not there. And then what happens after that? Well, there's no rules. Whatever happens after that is whatever happens after that. You know, if you like, the experience of life may change, it may not change, it may change in certain ways. If you talk to many people where this is seen, you'll probably realize that there are some commonalities as to what may happen in the experience once this has been seen, but there's absolutely no rules whatsoever about this, because we're talking about, Well, we're talking about everything and nothing, so we're talking about complete freedom. When I say we're talking about complete freedom, I don't mean we're talking about, you know, about the freedom for, say, me to do anything. I mean, of course not. You know, because we're talking about the realization that there is no me who does anything, if you like. But freedom in the sense that this allows whatever to be. You know, there's no rules around this. You know, there can be a tremendous collapse if the one who was seeking, let's say, I'll put it this way, has a kind of traditional flavor to their mind. So perhaps they sought for meaning through religious stories, religious paths, spiritual paths that require action, this sort of thing. Really anything that had a kind of belief system to it, that all tends to collapse. And there's just, you know, the freedom of what is, the freedom of whatever is, you know, so, you know, no rules, no paths, no preachers, no gurus, no swamis, no teachers, if I haven't said that one already. There's just the absolute freedom of whatever is. But, you know, if the mind gets hold of that and says, ah, that means I'm free to do whatever I want to do, that's a complete misunderstanding. That's the sort of thing that the mind might try to make of this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. The mind can be very tricky also at a very subtle level where it will, as long as there is a me or you think you're a person, then it will always, even in a very subtle way, like the ones you talked about when you have some meditation and you go beyond yourself. But as long as there is this self, then that's not it, right? So then you're still someone. And so it has to go all the way to that you're no one, and you just, I guess there's no, you know it when you are no one. You cannot not know it, right? I mean,
yeah. It is known. Yeah. Yes, I was just thinking, you know, when I was a spiritual seeker, you know, if I had a particularly beautiful meditation, for example, a particularly lovely meditation, then it would be quite likely that afterwards I would think, aha, I am a little bit closer now. You know, perhaps I'm one tiny little millimeter further higher up the path, up the spiritual mountain. Maybe. I mean, I might not have thought of it quite as naively as that, but that kind of thing. You know, now if I have a peaceful meditation, I have a peaceful meditation. That's lovely. You know, and you know, if I have a meal from the Indian restaurant, then I have a meal from the Indian restaurant. That might also be lovely. I mean, do you see what I'm trying to say there? It's like the meaning in these things that the mind assigns to them tends to collapse, I mean, it may not completely collapse because the mind can be very tricky, but it tends to collapse. So then there's just kind of whatever is happening, unfolding. I'm going to say, I'm a little reluctant to use this phrase, but I'll use it because it's popped into my head. What we're left with is whatever's happening, unfolding for its own sake. In other words, it doesn't need added meaning.
Yeah. Everything that happens, and if there's someone making meaning out of it or not, that doesn't matter. It's already full. It's already happening, and yeah, there's no difference. We can make meaning out of it. We can also not make meaning out of it. It happens. Yeah.
Yeah, just as there's no need to make meaning out of it, there's also no problem if meaning is made out of it. It's all simply what's happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
So part of that freedom has to do with, I would say, a genuine acceptance, not the kind of acceptance that has to be worked for on the spiritual path. You know, I must be more accepting today than I was yesterday, and tomorrow I will be even more accepting. It's not that. It's just a kind of natural, just noticing that what is. I mean, acceptance in a way is simply noticing that what is.
Yeah. Yeah.
including, by the way, non-acceptance. I mean, if resistance comes up to something, that could be called non-acceptance. Well, that's also what is. That's okay too. I mean,
Mhm.
they're really, I mean, when there's a lovely saying I like to quote about, there's something of the wind of freedom blowing through Advaita, blowing through non-duality. And that, I mean, you know, freedom is freedom, and it includes the freedom not to be free, if you like.
Yeah, yeah, the unconditional love that you spoke about earlier, it is, that would include that too, right? So it's, yeah.
Unconditional, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, people often ask questions about unconditional love, and I usually say, well, the problem with that phrase is not the word love. Most people, you know, unless someone's a complete psychopath, most people do have some kind of feeling in some way or other for what love is. Most people are not completely blank about what love is. The challenge in the phrase unconditional love is the word unconditional. Because unfortunately, unconditional does actually mean unconditional. In other words, unconditional love includes everything. If it didn't include everything, it's not unconditional. And if it includes everything, that means it includes everything that, for example, I, Richard, as a character, may intensely dislike. Perhaps, who knows? I mean, unconditional love is a real challenge in that sense. You know, I mean, I mean, this might sound a bit naive. Maybe nobody really thinks this, but I think, you know, sometimes people think unconditional love. Well, I summon up whatever love I'm capable of. I mean, it might be for my cat or my partner, or I don't know, my money, who knows. And then every day, perhaps I might work on that love becoming a little bit more, a little bit more. Eventually it will become unconditional. No, absolutely not. You know, unconditional love is in spite of the person.
Yeah, yeah. So it's unconditional love. Unconditional love is unconditional. And it's interesting because a lot of time in my life I'm like, oh, this unconditional love, and why don't I experience it anywhere? It's like, oh yeah, there is love and a lot of love going on between people, but it suddenly the love doesn't seem to be there, maybe, or what happened? That's not, does it exist? Does unconditional love really exist? And am I that myself too? Am I really unconditioning loving? And so it's there is it's almost like impossible, you know, to experience it as a human being somehow.
Not almost. It is absolutely impossible to experience it as a human being. I think unconditional love, and again, this is really a big part of the shock. Unconditional love is what's seen when the person is not there, and it's realized that it has nothing to do with me. It has nothing to do with what amount of love I may be able to personally and conditionally summon up or not summon up. So the kind of, in a way, or, you know, the stress and the strain of that, am I loving enough? Am I really unconditionally loving when I shouted at the man in the newspaper shop this morning? That's not unconditional love, is it? I mean, all of that can just kind of, you know, drop away with that mighty sound of relief, that kind of, when it's realized unconditional love is simply the case, and it doesn't have anything to do with the character that I think that I am. It's simply, if you like, the nature of everything and nothing. And as I was saying, the challenge really is in the unconditionality, because unconditional means it includes everything. If just one thing was excluded, then it's conditional. It's not unconditional love. I'll tell you a short anecdote, which I've included in a book and told before. I was giving a talk in Germany once, and there was a young woman in the audience who didn't say anything during the talk, and I thought possibly looked a little hostile to me, but I wasn't sure. At the end of the talk, we finished, and she came up to me, and she was sort of standing over me. I was still sitting there, and she was standing over me, what could have been a threatening manner, I didn't really know. And she said, you know, very sternly, she said, now, tell me, you talked about unconditional love, right? Tell me, does unconditional love include dog shit? And I said, well, yes, of course it does, because if it didn't, it wouldn't be unconditional. You know, at this point, for the first time in the whole evening, she smiled at me, this lovely warm smile, and she said, oh, she said, that is what I wanted you to say, or that is what I wanted to hear. And then she gave me a warm hug. Yeah, that's the challenge of unconditional love. You know, it's the unconditionality. The human mind cannot, I don't know how to finish that sentence, cannot get itself, if you like, around that. It's, you know, it's simply something that is seen to be the case, and it is utterly wonderful. But if the mind gets hold of it and says, okay, this is something that I must now do now, it can lead to a great deal of spiritual indigestion and worse.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's the, is as long as it's a person that deals with it, then it's not going to work, because that you're not even existing as a person as such. So yeah, it's and that's the thing with the mind. It will always misunderstand everything somehow, or relate it to itself. So it can never, that's why the mind can never get it. You have to go beyond the mind. But even going beyond the mind, there's no one to go beyond the mind, right? So
yes, the human being, if you like, you know, the person always lives in conditionality. You know, it's just inevitable. And of course, we can't go beyond the mind. If only we could. You know, this is again what a lot of, if you like, what a lot of spiritual paths might encourage. You know, but we cannot go beyond the mind. Nevertheless, the mind may collapse. If you like, the person may collapse, taking the apparent mind with it.
yeah, and that's it's like, we don't know. I mean, there's that, in a way it's nice also not to know. Okay, the unknown is like, okay, here I am as a person and I just don't know, and it's fine, and what happens happens, and that's it. Kind of, you can really relax in that too. Yeah, it's like the mind, putting the mind at rest it has a lot to do with just, okay, just, yeah, be who you are, be the human being you are, and just because you're whole and complete, just being this human being, everything is whole and complete. It may not seem like it, but it is. And then the mind will never get that. Like Holocaust, you mentioned in your book too, right? Or starving children in Africa. And that's actually what I started the path, because I was like, I cannot, all this suffering in the world, no way. And I heard, oh, enlightenment is going to solve it all. Then you can really help. And I'm like, whoa, yes. And the seeking start, right?
Yeah, you mentioned not knowing a few sentences back, and yeah, I mean, this is sometimes described as kind of like a great unknown. It's the realization of a deep unknowing, of a great unknowing. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the freedom in that. Yeah. Yeah, because the kind of, again, the kind of carrot, if you like, that's in sometimes held out or offered or implied on the spiritual path is somehow there will be a goal in which this will have all its questions answered. What actually happens is the realization that those questions will not and cannot be answered, and the kind of relaxation of that.
Yeah.
The questions, if you like, you could say die away, not because they're answered, but because it's finally realized they can't be, and they won't be, because this is a great unknowing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the mystery. Yeah. Yeah, so it's really just living the mystery. What can you do?
Yeah, sometimes I say, you know, what I mean, sometimes I say this is the mystical apprehension, you know, it's not the spiritual apprehension, it's the mystical apprehension, you know, where you will find this written about and talked about throughout history is amongst the mystics. And often to the mind, it will seem unfathomable. The sayings of mystics just seem absolutely unfathomable. It's like all the mind can do often is, what the hell does that mean? And then again, when the mind is, if you like, overthrown, when the sense of person drops and the mind is overthrown, then it just becomes obvious. So that's what the mystics were talking about. You know, I mean, I suppose, you know, I had this kind of conception as a person. You know, mystics are very tricky people. They always say things that they know nobody will understand. And then when this is seen, it's like, oh no, they were just trying to describe something. They're just trying to describe something that's kind of obvious when the person isn't there.
Yeah.
So when just quoting from one of my favorite Christian mystics, until I see that I am nothing, I cannot see that I am everything. You know, I mean, the mind of Richard would read that and go, what the hell does this mean? Why can't these damned mystics say something that we can understand? Why do they have to be so obscure? And then when this is seen, it's like, oh, that's what that means. There's nothing obscure about it at all. It is simply an attempt to describe the indescribable.
Yeah. Right. But the mind will be like, oh, what is this? And oh, this is so strange. And this is a paradox and da da da. Yeah.
Here's another one. Until I know that I am nothing, I cannot, until I see that I am nothing, I cannot see that I am love. And the mind of Richard as a seeker is going, what the hell does that mean? And then bang, Richard collapses. Oh, it's obvious. It's just a description. You know, first there's the seeing that this is nothing, and then there's the seeing that this is love, and that is love. And this glass of water is love. It's just a description. This mobile phone is love. It's just a description. There's nothing mysterious about it at all.
Yeah. It's just made of love. Everything is made of love. Yeah.
This glass of water is love in water form.
Yeah. 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 And that's, you know, we're one with the water. All the elements are one with one another. You could say water, fire, whatever the world is made of, you know, energies, whatever it's made out of, but it's all made out of that. It's one and the same with whatever you want to call it, right? Source or God or nothing, right? Nothing is everything. Yeah. It's just
source, God, Brahman, nothing, everything, love. It makes no difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Richard. It was I love this conversation. Thank you. And how can people how can people get in touch with
you? Probably most easily there's my website. There's a YouTube channel, there's an email, phone number and email address actually on my website. There's a YouTube channel, I have a Facebook page, they could join that, and then you know, if anything's happening, any events are happening, it goes on there. There's an email newsletter. If they want to be on that, they could just get my email address to my website and email me. My partner and I are about to start doing live Zoom meetings next month, once a month on Nothing Media. So that's another place they could go to.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no shortage of ways to contact me if people really want to.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Who
wonderful.
knows? One of these days we might even be able to have live meetings again, where we actually meet in
Yeah.
a hall. Although one of the wonderful things, I mean, you know, I would not have wanted this lockdown, but one of the wonderful things that's come out of it, of course, is that there's so much, let's say, international communication going on. You know, the fact that everything now is having to take place on Zoom, it means that, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're in London or Ontario or Denmark or New York. It's all equal now. Distance has been taken out of the equation, which is glorious in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's nice that we can meet from all over the world so easily, although it's virtual. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. No, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.